Within an hour of the ceremony's conclusion, Princess Ladi found herself seated in a simple cart, her belongings hastily packed into traveling bags. The elaborate wedding feast had been reduced to a brief reception where guests could offer congratulations before the couple's hurried departure. King Taiwo embraced his daughter with tears in his eyes, though he couldn't explain the sense of foreboding that had settled over him like a shroud. "Write to me often," he whispered in her ear, "and remember that you will always have a home here if you need one." Those would be the last words Princess Ladi would hear from her father for a very long time. Kande had insisted on accompanying the princess, as was traditional for royal brides traveling to distant homes. She rode in the cart beside Princess Ladi, her grandfather's medicine bag hidden among her personal belongings. As their small procession, just the cart, 2 guards provided by King Taiwo, and Aduni walking alongside, left the palace gates, Kande looked back at the golden walls of home and wondered if she would ever see them again. The journey began normally enough, but as they traveled farther from the kingdom's heart, the very landscape began to change. The well-maintained roads gave way to rough paths. The cultivated fields and orderly villages were replaced by wild grasslands and scattered settlements. And always ahead of them loomed the dark line of the deep forest, growing larger and more ominous with each passing hour. Princess Ladi tried to make conversation with her new husband, but Aduni had become increasingly distant as they traveled. He spoke only when necessary, and his responses to her questions were brief and cryptic. "How long have you lived in the forest?" she asked. "Long enough to know all its secrets," he replied. "Do you have family there? Friends?" "I have everything I need," was his only answer. By midday, even the royal guards were beginning to show signs of unease. The path they followed seemed to shift and change when no one was looking directly at it. Landmarks that should have remained fixed, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree with twisted branches, appeared in different positions when glanced from the corner of one's eye. "Sir," one of the guards said to Aduni, "are you certain we are traveling the correct route? This path seems usual." Aduni turned those pale green eyes on the guard with an expression of mild annoyance. "I have walked these paths for more years than you have been alive, soldier. Do not question my knowledge of my own territory." The guard fell silent, but Kande noticed that his hand never left the hilt of his sword. As afternoon wore on toward evening, the trees began to close in around them. What had started as scattered groves became dense woodland, then true forest where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. And that's when they heard the first sounds that shouldn't have been there. Whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves, and occasionally the distant sound of crying that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. Just as true darkness began to fall, they emerged into a clearing where Aduni's home stood waiting for them. Princess Ladi's first sight of her new home should have prepared her for what was to come, but the human mind struggles to accept horrors too great to comprehend. The house was large, much larger than a simple hunter's dwelling should have been. It was built from dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its many windows glowed with a sickly yellow illumination that hurt to look at directly. But it was the sounds coming from within that made Princess Ladi's blood freeze in her veins. Children crying, women weeping, and underneath it all, a low humming sound like voices chanting in an unknown language. "Welcome home, my dear," Adoni said, his voice now carrying undertones that hadn't been there before. Darker, older, filled with satisfaction at a plan coming to fruition. As they approached the front door, it opened without anyone touching it. The light that spilled out was that same sickly yellow glow, and with it came scents that made Princess Lade gag, incense mixed with decay,
herbs meant to mask odors too terrible to name. And then Princess Ladi saw them. Women of various ages stood in the doorway and hallway beyond, but they moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes unfocused and their faces bearing expressions of resigned despair. Some were beautiful, others plain, but all shared the same hollow look of people whose spirits had been broken. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, dozens of children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all with the same pale green eyes as Adoni, all unnaturally quiet and still. "My family," Adoni announced with obvious pride. "Your new family, Princess Ladi." One of the women, tall and elegant, with graying hair that suggested she had once been a great beauty, stepped forward with mechanical movement. "Welcome, sister," she said in a voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am Folake, the first wife. I will show you to your quarters." Princess Ladi realized with growing horror that she hadn't married a man, she had been delivered to a monster who collected women like trophies. The royal guard, sensing the wrongness of the situation, moved closer to Princess Ladi. "Princess," one said quietly, "perhaps we should." He never finished the sentence. Adoni raised one hand and both guards simply collapsed where they stood, not dead but unconscious, their minds overwhelmed by psychic force they couldn't comprehend. "They will sleep until morning," Adoni said conversationally. "Then they will begin their journey home with a message for your father that you have arrived safely and are very happy in your new life." But Princess Ladi knew that the guards would carry no such message. They would return to King Taiwo with their memories altered, convinced that they had left her in a normal home with a normal husband. "Kande stays with me," Princess Ladi managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," Adoni agreed with false magnanimity. "Faithful servants are so hard to find. She will be quite useful here." As they were led into the house, Princess Ladi caught Kande's eye and saw her own terror reflected there. But she also saw something else, determination and the glimmer of a plan. Kande had not come unprepared for this confrontation. Princess Ladi's quarters turned out to be a room, barely larger than a servant's chamber back at the palace. The walls were bare wood, the furniture simple and rough, and the single window was barred from the outside. This wasn't a bedroom, it was a prison cell. But more disturbing than the accommodations was what Princess Ladi learned during her first night in Adoni's house. The other wives gathered around her after the evening meal, a sparse affair of thin soup and dark bread, and told her their stories in whispered voices that wouldn't carry to their husbands' ears. Folake, the first wife, was a princess from a kingdom that no longer existed, stolen away 50 years ago on what was supposed to be her wedding day to another man. 50 years? Princess Ladi gasped. "But you don't look..." "She keeps us alive far beyond our natural span," Folake explained with dead eyes. "But not out of kindness. We age slowly because he feeds on our life force, our beauty, our hope. When we have nothing left to give, we disappear." Another wife, Amina, had been a wealthy merchant's daughter, taken 30 years before. "I had 6 children by him," she whispered. "When they grew old enough to question why their father never aged, they began to disappear as well. He called it going to serve other households, but we knew better." Princess Ladi began to understand the true scope of the horror she had walked into. Adoni wasn't just a sorcerer who collected wives. He was a creature that sustained himself by draining the life essence from others. The children served him until they became old enough to be threats or useful elsewhere. Then they too vanished into his network of dark magic. "How many have they been?" Princess Ladi asked. "I stopped counting after the 20th wife," Folake replied. "Some last decades if they are strong, others fade within years. It depends on how much life force you have to begin with and how much you fight against him." That's when Princess Ladi realized why Adoni had been so determined to claim her specifically. As a princess with royal blood, she would have more life force than common women. Her beauty and youth would sustain him longer, and her magical ability, the same power that had enabled her to curse the princes, would be particularly valuable to him. But most importantly, her connection to the kingdom of Kush would mean that her disappearance would be explained and accepted. No one would come looking for a princess who had married and moved away to live with her husband's family. While Princess Ladi was learning the truth about her situation, Kande was conducting her own investigation of the house and its supernatural defenses. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears and gave her the information she needed to fight back. The house itself was a construct of dark magic, larger inside than outside, with rooms that existed in spaces that shouldn't have been possible. The basement extended far deeper than any normal foundation, and from its depths came sounds that suggested horrors beyond imagination. But more importantly, Kande identified the source of Adoni's power, a series of magical focal points throughout the house, where he had placed artifacts that channeled and stored the life force he stole from his victims. Using her grandfather's training, she could sense the flow of magical energy like a river of darkness running through the building structure, and rivers she knew from her grandfather's teachings could be dammed or redirected if one knew how. That first night, while the house slept under Adoni's supernatural influence, Kande began her preparations. From her hidden medicine bag, she retrieved items that had been blessed by generations of healers in her family, crystals charged with protective energy, herbs that could repel dark magic, and most importantly, a small silver amulet that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman who had been renowned for her ability to combat evil sorcery. But the most critical item was her grandfather's journal. By candlelight, she studied the pages that dealt specifically with breaking the power of life-draining magic. The process would be dangerous, potentially fatal, but it was possible. According to her grandfather's research, a sorcerer like Adoni could only be defeated by someone willing to offer their own life force as a weapon against him. The key was to channel that energy not as sustenance for the dark magic, but as a purifying force that would destroy the connections between the sorcerer and his victims. It was essentially a magical form of warfare that could only be won through self-sacrifice. For 3 days, Princess Lade was forced to live the nightmare that the other wives had endured for decades. She was required to perform menial labor, cooking, cleaning, caring for the younger children, while Adoni slowly began the process of draining her life force. The method was insidious and terrifying. Each night he would visit her room and place his hands on her forehead, claiming it was a blessing to help her adjust to her new life. But Princess Lade could feel something being pulled from her during these sessions: warmth, energy, the very essence of what made her herself. After the first session, her hair lost some of its luster. After the second, her skin began to look pale and drawn. By the third night, she could barely stand without assistance. But Adoni was careful not to drain her too quickly. He wanted to savor his prize. "You are adjusting beautifully, my dear," he told her as she struggled to serve him his evening meal with hands that shook from weakness. "Soon, you will understand that resistance is futile, and you will find peace in acceptance, just as the others have." That's when Princess Ladi realized that Folaki and the other wives hadn't always been the hollow, emotionless women she saw now. They had once been vibrant, strong, defiant, just like her. Adoni's power didn't just steal life force. It eventually consumed the very personality and will of his victims. She was going to become a living ghost, conscious, but without the power to think or feel independently. But that night, as Princess Ladi lay in her narrow bed, too weak to even cry, she heard a soft tapping at her barred window. "Princess," came Kande's whispered voice. "Are you strong enough to listen?" Princess Ladi managed to crawl to the window, where she could see Kande's face in the moonlight. Her faithful servant, who had somehow managed to move freely around the outside of the house. "I know how to stop him," Kande whispered urgently. "But I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. Can you do that?" Princess Ladi nodded, not trusting her voice. "Tomorrow night, when he comes to drain your energy, you must resist with everything you have left. Don't try to fight him physically. Fight him with your will, your anger, your refusal to surrender. I need him focused entirely on you." "What are you going to do?" Princess Ladi managed to whisper. "What my grandfather trained me for," Kande replied grimly. "I'm going to cut the connections that give him power. But Princess, there's something you need to know. The process might destroy the house and everything in it. You need to be ready to get the other wives and children to safety." Princess Ladi felt a spark of her old strength returning at the thought of saving the other victims. "I understand." "One more thing," Kande said, pressing something small and warm through the bars. "Wear this tomorrow night. It will help protect you during what's to come." Princess Ladi looked down to see her grandfather's silver amulet gleaming in the moonlight. The final battle. The next evening began like all the others, but Princess Lade was ready. She had spent the day quietly speaking to the other wives and older children, using their shared desperation to plant seeds of hope and rebellion. She couldn't tell them exactly what was planned, but she managed to convey that something would happen that night, and they needed to be prepared to act quickly when it did. Even in their diminished states, the other victims responded to the first leadership they had experienced in years. When Aduni came to her room for the nightly draining session, Princess Lade was wearing the silver amulet beneath her rough dress, and her mind was focused not on her weakness, but on her anger. Anger at being deceived, anger at the suffering she had witnessed, and most of all, anger at a monster who preyed on desperate people seeking help. "You seem different tonight, my dear," Aduni observed as he approached her bed, more spirited than usual. "I am a princess of Kush," Princess Lade replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I am not some common prey for you to consume." Aduni laughed, a sound like glass breaking in an empty tomb. "Princess, peasant, merchant's daughter, it makes no difference to me. You all taste the same when I drain away your essence." He placed his hands on her forehead, and immediately Princess Lade felt the familiar pulling sensation as her life force began to flow into him. But this time, instead of trying to escape the feeling, she embraced it and pushed back. The silver amulet around her neck began to glow with warm white light. Aduni jerked his hands away as if burned, staring at Princess Lade with surprise and growing anger. "What is this? Where did you get that trinket?" "A gift from the friend," Princess Lade replied, rising from her bed with strength she shouldn't have possessed. The amulet's glow was spreading, filling the small room with light that made the shadows retreat into the corners. And at that moment, Kande struck. From somewhere deep in the house came a sound like thunder, followed by screams that were definitely not human. The building itself shook, and through the walls came flashes of blue and silver light that pulsed with the rhythm of a racing heartbeat. Aduni's face contorted with rage and fear. "What is happening? What have you done?" But he was no longer looking at Princess Lade. His attention was focused on the growing supernatural chaos echoing through his domain. In the basement of the house, Kande was engaged in the most dangerous magical working of her family's history. Using her grandfather's techniques and the power stored in his ancient artifacts, she was systematically destroying the focal points that channeled stolen life force throughout the building. Each destroyed focal point released decades of accumulated energy back to the universe, creating explosions of purifying light that burned away the dark magic like acid dissolving metal. But the process was killing her. Every spell she cast, every artifact she activated drained more of her own life force. She was essentially using herself as a conduit to transform Aduni's stolen power from a tool of evil into a force of liberation. Her grandfather's journal had been very clear about the cost. To break the power of a life drainer, one must be willing to give life freely without reservation or hope of survival. The magic recognizes the difference between power taken by force and power offered in love. As Kande's magical assault continued, the impossible architecture of Aduni's house began to collapse in on itself. Rooms that had existed in folded space unraveled back into normal dimensions. Walls that had been held together by dark magic crumbled into dust. And as each collapse happened, more of the life force was released. The other wives began to change as their stolen years were returned to them. Some became younger, their true ages restored. Others simply regained the vitality and will that had been drained away over decades of captivity.
Folake, the first wife, looked at her hands in amazement as strength flowed back into her limbs. "I can feel again," she whispered in wonder. "I can think clearly for the first time in 50 years. But Aduni was not defeated yet. With a roar of fury that shook the foundations of reality, the ancient sorcerer abandoned his human disguise entirely. His true form erupted through the confines of mortal flesh, a creature of shadow and hunger that towered nearly to the ceiling, with eyes like burning coals and claws that could rend both flesh and spirit. "You think to defeat me with peasant magic," he snarled at Princess Lade, his voice now a harmony of discordant tones that hurt to hear. "I have consumed the life force of hundreds. I am older than your kingdom, more powerful than your bloodline." But his power was already diminishing. With each focal point that Kande destroyed in the basement, Aduni became smaller, weaker, more desperate. The magical connections that had sustained him for centuries were being severed one by one. Princess Lade faced the monster with the silver amulet blazing around her neck like a small sun. "You fed on despair and helplessness," she said, her voice carrying the authority of true royalty. "But we are neither desperate nor helpless anymore." Around them, the freed wives and children were helping each other towards the exit as the building continued to collapse. But their movements were no longer the shuffling steps of broken spirits. They moved with purpose and hope. From the basement came one last explosion of light, so bright that it turned night to day throughout the clearing. When the radiance faded, the house had collapsed completely, leaving only scattered debris and a few still standing walls. But the silence that followed was more terrible than any sound. Princess Lade struggled through the rubble, calling Kande's name. The other women and children searched also, their gratitude to their unknown savior overriding their fear of the destruction around them. They found Kande at the center of what had been the basement, lying motionless among the remains of her grandfather's artifacts. Her body was unmarked, but her life force had been completely expended in the magical battle. She had given everything to save them all. Princess Lade knelt beside her faithful friend, tears streaming down her face. "Kande, please, you saved us. You saved everyone. Please, don't leave me now." But Kande's eyes remained closed and no breath stirred her chest. Of Aduni, there was no trace at all. Not even ash remained of the creature that had terrorized so many for so long.
The journey back to the kingdom of Kush was unlike any procession that had ever traveled those roads. Princess Ladi led a group of 37 freed prisoners, wives ranging in age from barely 20 to over 70, and children from toddlers to young adults. Some chose to return to their original homes, if those places still existed. Others, who had no families left to reclaim them, chose to accompany Princess Ladi back to her father's kingdom. The reunion between Princess Ladi and King Taiwo was a moment of joy mixed with profound sorrow. The king wept when he saw his daughter alive and free, but his tears turned to rage when she told him the full story of Adoni's deception and the horrors she had endured. "I should have seen through his disguise," King Taiwo said, his voice heavy with guilt. "A father should protect his daughter, not hand her over to a monster." "You couldn't have known, father. His magic was ancient and powerful. He had deceived desperate people for centuries." But the king's remorse was nothing compared to Princess Ladi's grief over Kande's sacrifice. A royal funeral was held for the servant who had saved the princess and freed dozens of innocent victims. Kande was honored not as a servant, but as a hero of the kingdom, and her name was inscribed in the royal chronicles alongside the greatest warriors and wise men in Kush's history. Her grandfather's journal was placed in the royal library, where future generations could learn from the magical knowledge that had proved strong enough to defeat ancient evil. The Princess Ladi, who returned to Kush, was a fundamentally different person from the one that had left it. Gone was the arrogance and cruelty that had led to her original curse. The woman who had mocked suitors and cursed them for sport had been replaced by someone who understood suffering, who valued loyalty above all else, and who had learned that true strength comes not from the power to harm others, but from the courage to sacrifice for them. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned the difference between magic used for selfish purposes and magic used for love. She established a sanctuary within the palace grounds for the women and children who had been freed from Adoni's house. Those who chose to stay in Kush were given homes, occupations, and the chance to rebuild lives that had been stolen from them. Princess Ladi also instituted new laws throughout the kingdom, specifically designed to protect people who might be vulnerable to supernatural predators. Anyone claiming supernatural healing abilities had to be examined by a council of wise women trained to detect deceptive magic. And she never forgot the lesson that cost Kande her life. Every year, on the anniversary of their escape from the forest house, Princess Ladi held a ceremony honoring all those who had died fighting dark magic. But the centerpiece of the ceremony was always a moment of silence for Kande, the servant whose loyalty and grandfather's wisdom had proved stronger than centuries of accumulated evil. Years passed, and Princess Ladi eventually became Queen Ladi, ruling Kush with a wisdom born from suffering and a compassion earned through loss. She never married again, not because she feared men, but because she had learned that some bonds transcend romantic love. Her deepest connection had been with Kande, a friendship built on loyalty and maintained through the ultimate test. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned how she understood power itself. The queen who once used magic to curse innocent suitors now used her abilities to heal and protect. She established schools where young people with magical talents could learn to use their gifts responsibly. She created networks of communication between kingdoms, warning others about supernatural threats. And most importantly, she ensured that Kande's sacrifice was never forgotten. In the end, Princess Ladi had learned the greatest lesson of all, that true royalty is not measured by the power to take, but by the willingness to give. The kingdom of Kush flourished under her rule, becoming known throughout the continent not for its gold or its armies, but for its compassion and its queen's commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would prey upon them. And in the royal gardens, where Princess Ladi often walked in the evenings, there stood a memorial to Kande, a simple stone carved with words that captured the essence of their friendship. She gave everything so that others might be free. The cursed princess had become a blessing to her people, and the memory of a faithful servant had become the foundation of a just reign. This tale reminds us that true transformation comes not from magic spells or royal proclamations, but from the courage to sacrifice for others and the wisdom to learn from our failures. Princess Ladi's story began with cruelty and pride, but ended with compassion and justice, a transformation that was only possible because someone loved her enough to give everything for her salvation. What would you have done in Kande's place? Would you have risked everything for a friend who had never shown you the respect you deserved? And what about Princess Ladi? Do you believe people can truly change? Or was her transformation simply the result of fear and circumstances? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of loyalty, sacrifice, and redemption moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crown Jewel Broken Crowns for more tales of royal intrigue, ancient magic, and the price of power. Until our next story, remember, the greatest magic of all is the love that moves us to protect those who cannot protect themselves.